Good evening. My name is Mari Matsuo. I'm going to be your chairperson tonight. Just a little bit about me. I'm a locally based activist. I focus mostly on anti-war, anti-imperialism, some kind of environmental stuff, social justice, pretty much as many issues as I can. I feel it's really important to learn about as many different struggles so that I can help other people find that one issue that's going to make them passionate enough to take a stand.
They're all connected.
Exactly. Yeah, intersectionality, definitely. And my big focus also is just putting out as much information as I can on social media, because I really want to get people my age to feel like it's cool to stand for something, and it's not just for, crazies and people on the fringe. It's something that everybody can do. So I really try to take lots of pictures and be like, somebody who's an activist, you can be one too. So a little bit about the James Connolly Forum. James Connolly came to the United States in 1902 and moved to Troy in 1903, setting up house at 96 Ingalls Ave, which is just a few blocks away from us here. He worked for the Metropolitan Insurance Company until a recession caused the firm to falter. And while he was here, he was active in the Socialist Labor Party, where he engaged in a notable dispute with its leader, Daniel DeLeon, over the utility of fighting for wage increases, which he was for, and also some other questions. And as most of you probably know, when he returned to Ireland, he played a leading role in the great labor conflicts like the Dublin lockout of 1913, and he also led the Irish Citizen Army in its uprising against the British rule in 1916. He was executed by the British as a result of this work, and today he is recognized as one of the great socialist leaders of the 20th century. So before we get started, I just wanted to ask if anyone has any announcements they wanted to make about upcoming events.
Just the next forum will be with Brian Jones on February 20th, unless we come up with something else earlier than that, but we may not do something in January, just to let everybody know.
Did you have something?
Yeah, January 13th, there's the Assembly is having a public hearing on single-payer health care at the Legislative Office Building, and they're taking testimony from, people. So if you want to try to get that done.
Okay.
On February 18th, we're going to be showing a film about Cuba's role in the independence of Namibia and Angola and helping end apartheid. That's going to be February 18th at the Albany Public Library. If somebody's not getting our emails, see me and I'll be glad to include you.
The People's State of the State action is going to be at the Capitol on the day before the official State of the State on January 6th. Sponsored by Hunger Action and a number of different groups, and I have a lot to say. That's it, 11:45.
Yeah, hi, the Albany County Legislature is going to have a hearing on Monday, December 29th. Yes, that's correct. And there is a proposal that the legislature passed to set up a commission to reduce the size of the county legislature from 39 to 29 people by the end of next year. And it's my view that if the legislature is reduced by that much, we're going to lose a lot of African Americans, liberals, and activists on the legislature, and it will be much more difficult to get anything good through the legislature after that. I have an information sheet about it here, which you can pick up on the way out if you want. Thank you.
Sure.
The Martin Luther King Labor Celebration will be held January 19th. They have flyers all over the state. You can get them on your way out. People will attend.
On January 7th, there will be a huge anti-fracking demonstration, not one wells, at the Capitol. It's going to be really important because everybody sort of expects the governor's going to announce some fracking decision that's not going to be favorable before the end of this year.
Okay. So now I want to introduce the speaker, Vijay Prashad. He is the George and Martha Kellner Chair in South Asian History and Professor of International Studies at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut. He is the author of 16 books, including The Poor Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, a columnist for Frontline in India, a regular contributor to The Hindu of India, and a contributing editor for Hindu South Asia, which is in Nepal, and for Ball in Pakistan. He is a regular contributor to the US website Counterpunch. He is currently writing No Free Left, The Futures of Indian Communism, and Dispatches from Greater Arabia, based on his reporting from Greater Arabia from 2003 to 2014. He has just returned from a year teaching at the American University of Beirut, Lebanon, where he had a close-up view of the war in Syria. So the James Connolly Forum would like to welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mary. Thanks, John. This is, I think, my third time at the James Connolly Forum. Happy to be here, James Connolly. It's so great to hear what people are involved in. By the way, I hate fracking, but I love the word fracking. It just sounds like an insult. Fracking. That fracking governor. I think we should use, completely transform it. It's a terrific word. It has such color. This fracking weather. I'm so glad everybody's involved in something. The world is falling apart. There's no antidote to this collapsing world than to be involved in it. I was happy to hear about the Jewish Boys for Peace demonstration today, Black Lives Matter. The more things we're involved in, the more we feel alive. Yeah. I think, because it's a crappy world. It's a fracking world. It's a fracking world. I'm going to talk to you really about, it's a simple proposition. You might ask me a question, what's wrong with Muslims? And that's the answer I'm going to give you, is to this great question. Why is this thing keep happening? ISIS on the one side. On the other side today, the news comes in Peshawar, 140 people killed, over 100 of them children. What's wrong with Muslims? It's the question that goes through a lot of people's minds. And I think people in this room are too polite to ask it. But other people directly talk about it, and I want to actually address this directly. But I'm not going to address this doctrinally, what's wrong with Islam, why is Islam a language of hate or whatever, what you hear about. I'm not going to talk about it like that. I'm going to talk about it historically, to talk about how we got to the place where this brilliant part of the world, Waziristan, which produced an amazing socialist movement in the 1940s, called the Khudai Khidmatgars, where there was a man who was known as the Frontier Gandhi. Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan was a great leader of the Pashto-speaking people. How the hell did we go from Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan to the Taliban? That's one question. At that end of, this territory. At the other end, how did we go from Iraq, which had the largest communist party in West Asia, which had one of the greatest histories of progressive left-wing activism, to the shit you see now in northern Iraq in the name of ISIS, So that's the story I'm going to tell you, is how did we get here? And I think the historical answer is the best way to counter the view that this has something to do with Islam. Because, that's the question du jour. And I think it's very important to counter that question with, I think, really some force, not to duck it, not to say, well, no, actually Islam is the language of peace. I think that's a useless answer to the question, why is there, the Taliban to the Islamic State? We need much more in our arsenal to fight against that attitude than this ridiculous liberal view that, no, religion is actually good. Judaism is really good, Netanyahu is a jerk. Islam is really good, the Islamic State is crazy. Christianity is a religion of peace, every single Republican is off their nut. This is not enough for me, this liberal argument, that religion is actually good and that bad people misuse it. We need to have a better argument to explain what's going on. So that's what I'm going to try to work out. In October, I had a very eye-opening experience because I drove up to meet these fighters from Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the official Al-Qaeda in Syria. And I'm sitting by the side of the road with these guys, and they all look like Jesus, which is one of the amazing things about these religious fighters, is that they all somehow approximate that look, the wispy beards and the hair coming down, and except of course they have bullet vests and Kalashnikovs and, things that Jesus himself didn't carry, but I'm sure his henchmen had knives and spears, and, all these religious books are basically the nice version. They don't give you reality, which is that I bet he had bodyguards and people as well. Those were some rough days, in the old world. Anyway, these guys were sitting around and I was interviewing them. I was interested, this 19-year-old kid who was an engineering student. What's with engineering students? So many of these people study science and then become extremists. So anyway, this kid was an engineering student from the city of Tripoli, one of the most beautiful cities on the Mediterranean. This is Tripoli in Lebanon, not Tripoli in Libya. Although during the Libyan war, CNN ran a map which showed Tripoli in Lebanon. Anyway, because that's the idiocy of the media. The American media does not cover this part of the world. Okay. I'm talking to this guy and I'm saying to him, tell me your life story, essentially. He's an Al-Qaeda guy and I'm thinking, he must have a really bloodthirsty life story. Well, he tells me he studied engineering and he's telling me about his parents and he's telling me about his ambitions, and then he gives me the headline. He said, if I had a job, I wouldn't do jihad. Job, jihad. Job, jihad. And I thought, that's it. Jobs versus jihad. That's it. Now remember, during the Arab Spring, when, millions of people flooded Tahrir Square in Cairo, Tahrir Square in Baghdad, Tahrir victory squares in every bloody Arab capital, basically from Libya out to Iraq. Young people flooded these squares. Bourgeois media, Atlantic Council, Brookings Institution, Carnegie, etc., they all talked about the youth bulge. That there was a demographic problem in the Arab world. There were all these corrupt states, and there were these young people who just couldn't find work. And there's a serious problem that these states are simply not equipped to deal with, and therefore the Arab Spring was, in a sense, young people demanding, as they did in Tahrir Square, bread, freedom, justice. These were their demands. Bread was important, in other words, jobs. Well, that was okay when it was people that the American media and intelligentsia could basically say are people like us. They are liberal-minded people who want to live free of authoritarianism, and there's a youth bulge, they want jobs. There was a massive crackdown on them, including in Iraq, and then some of these same people grow their hair long, go out into the thing, take up guns, and they become the very characters I'm meeting. And now it's not convenient to talk about the youth bulge. It's not convenient when we talk about the Islamic State to ask questions. Who are the young people signing up to fight there? It's not convenient to ask who are the Syrians and Iraqis who are fighting there. It's much easier for the media to concentrate on the Chechenian fighters, the British Muslim fighters, the fighters from Philippines. The hardened, most outrageous characters get all the press. You forget that there are actually entire armies of the Islamic State who are not beheading people. I'm going to come back to them. I just wanted to give you a sense that it's convenient to talk about unemployment when you think that the people protesting are liberals. It's inconvenient to talk about unemployment when the people protesting are crazy. How did they get here? Well, if you look back at the 1950s in the Arab world, there was an upsurge of the left. And the upsurge on the left didn't come necessarily from the communists, although communist parties in the Arab world were very powerful into the 1950s. In fact, in Syria, there was a serious threat in 1958 of a communist revolution, which is why they united with Egypt. I mean, the Syrian nationalist bourgeoisie basically turned to the Egyptians and save us from the left. There was a serious threat in 58 in Syria. In 1958, when there was a revolution in Iraq, it was to overthrow the monarchy set up by the British. It was led by a military officer who was a Nasserite, but this Nasserite Colonel Qasim was backed by the Iraqi Communist Party, an enormously disciplined and powerful party that was across all religious denominations, a very powerful party. And they provided Qasim with the kind of mechanism to run his government, because he didn't have a party. It's all very well to conduct a coup. The next day, what do? I mean, you have the military with you, but military doesn't know how to run a government. So he turned over a lot of the important offices of governance to the communists in 1958. So the Nasserites and the communists were a serious threat to the powers of imperialism in the 1950s in the Arab region and in North Africa. Well, this threat is answered in different registers. One register to answer this threat was in 1956 when the French, the Israelis, and the British invaded the Suez Canal. And that was the great invasion of the Suez, which was against Nasserism, which was one part of the great leftist upsurge. Nasser, of course, himself was a deep anti-communist. So there was no love between the left and the nationalists. But both were seen by the forces of empire as equivalent threats, even though there was great divides between them. But they were seen as equivalent threats. So one mechanism for empire to act was direct invasion. The Americans opposed this because this smelled too much like the old colonial adventures. Other ways had to be discovered. Alliances were worked out between the so-called forces of counter-revolution in the region. And the greatest force of counter-revolution in that region is not actually the United States, it's not Israel, but it's Saudi Arabia, which had the most to lose, in a way, by the Nasserite emergence. And, there was, I don't mean this, in terms of ideology alone. In 1956, when Gamal Abdel Nasser was an incredibly charismatic person, arrived in Saudi Arabia, he went to the oil regions of the country, and he was, welcomed like a hero. And the Saudi monarchy was very afraid that there would be a coup or a Nasserite uprising. In fact, there was an uprising in Saudi Arabia. It was not in the army, which had been subordinated, it was within the palace. It was the Free Princes movement, not the Free Officers movement. And the leader of the Free Princes was expelled to Lebanon, where his son later would set up an endowment, which is what hired me to go to Lebanon last year. So I was a beneficiary of the Free Princes movement, run by Sheikh Walid bin Talal, who, by the way, is the richest Arab in the world today and owns Goldman Sachs. He's a majority shareholder. He owns Twitter. So, but his dad was a Nasserite. Okay. Saudi Arabia, the United States, the European powers had a very close understanding that they had a lot to lose if the Nasserites, the nationalists, and the communists were to come to any dominance. By the way, if I asked you what was the most powerful communist party in Africa in the 1950s, which country would you pick? Most powerful communist party? Congo, Egypt,
South Africa.
none of these. South Africa, no. The most powerful communist party in two respects. One is per capita membership, and the second was power in institutions, was Sudan. Sudan had the most powerful communist party in Africa, but the Sudanese, and by the way, it was crushed by Nimeri, the Nasserite leader, but anyway, that comes later. These were serious threats to imperial interests in the region. How to tackle this threat was an important problem for Saudi Arabia in particular, because it was directly threatened. So what was the response? Well, the response came in 2-3 different ways. Firstly, the Saudis very cannily set up in 1962 an organization called the World Muslim League, whose goal was a simple one: to finance the production of literature that attacked directly, ideologically attacked Nasserism, nationalism in general, the Ba'ath movement, and communism as anti-Islamic. So big production, ideological production against any left idea, saying that it's not only anti-Islamic but anti-Arab, that the Arab consciousness revolts against left-wing ideas. So the World Muslim League produced this literature. Over time, it would produce literature not only in Arabic, but in languages for the people of Dagestan and Chechnya, where the literature was spread with CIA, immense CIA support, inside Soviet Central Asia, where they were able to get this literature in to foment problems inside the Soviet Union, and then of course in South Asia, where I'm going to come later in a second to Pakistan, where it played a huge role. So the World Muslim League was one institution the Saudis created. Secondly, the Saudis recognized very cleverly that there was a serious problem in terms of the arrival of this kind of third world nationalism on the world stage, because it had this progressive content to it. So in 1961, when the third world created a group called the Non-Aligned Movement in Belgrade, it produced a set of principles which were very much against the West. The West hated the arrival of the Non-Aligned Movement, but the Saudis also. So the Saudis went to work with two other countries. One was Morocco, where they have had a very close historical relation, very conservative approach to world politics, and the other was Pakistan. And these three countries will, over the course of 2 or 3 years, develop a platform, and in 1969 create the Organization of Islamic Countries, which meets annually and was at the time a direct challenge to the Third World Movement in the guise of the Non-Aligned Movement. So you had the World Muslim League spreading a set of very conservative ideas against the arrival of the left. You had the Organization of Islamic Countries fighting against the creation of this bloc of countries that was both against the West and the Soviet Union, but typically leaned left. And the OIC largely took positions favorable to the West. It was really part of the West's worldview, even though it was couched in the language of Islam. It was the Organization of Islamic Countries. Pakistan had already joined the Baghdad Pact, which was like NATO, but for the region of the world from basically West Asia. Pakistan was a central member of the Baghdad Pact, and it becomes the closest ally of Saudi Arabia in this developing movement. What I consider to be a socio-political movement that had world-transforming effects from the 1950s to the present. That these two countries had a very close alliance, very close allegiance. One great example of this alliance was in 1970, when the so-called vermin of the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, had to be removed from Jordan. It was, after all, Pakistani brigadiers, including Zia-ul-Haq, who then becomes the dictator of Pakistan from 1977 until his death in 1988. Zia-ul-Haq led a detachment in Jordan against the Palestinians in the Black September crushing of the PLO. You know, Pakistani forces were directly on the ground in West Asia working as part of the instrument of counter-revolution. So these are two institutional developments in the 50s and 60s, the World Muslim League and the Organization of Islamic Countries. They were directly positioned not to revive Islam or to bring back Wahhabism. You know, their interest wasn't religious. Their interest was political. They were threatened by developments in their own societies. And they were helped along by the West, which was equally threatened by these developments. Nasser was a serious problem for Mr. Dulles, you know, one of the worst characters in 20th century American history. Dulles, you know, would never even use the word non-alignment. He used to like to talk about neutralism. You know, you can't be neutral. Remember that Howard Zinn line, you can't be neutral on a moving train. That was exactly what Dulles believed. There's no neutralism between totalitarianism and freedom. You got to make a choice. So these are neutralists, you know, derisively he would talk about them. And he hated Nasser, you know, to the level where reading his papers on Nasser is disturbing. You know, and it's not like Nasser was without flaws. But this was politics. This was not about religion. It was not merely religion. Okay. Now, in 1979, these currents are going to go into overdrive. A couple of things happen. Number one, in 1979, there is the Iranian Revolution. Now, this revolution plays a huge role, especially in the current sectarian tone that has crept into the politics of the region. Why this revolution was so threatening to Saudi Arabia is clear. There had been previous revolutions against kings in the Arab world. After all, Nasser himself had thrown out King Farouk in 1952. it was not unusual for a king to be deposed. But in those cases, in Egypt, in Iraq, in these cases, kings were deposed by overtly secular political forces. Those whom the Saudis could quite easily say were anti-Arab. Because Arabs require a different kind of political dispensation. Arabs cannot be ruled by these secular, westernized, communist, etc. So it was easy to dismiss them. The Iranians actually had an interesting challenge. The Iranians produced an Islamic form of republic. When the Iranian Revolution becomes the Islamic Republic, they don't elect a king. They have, a slate of readers. Vilayati Faqih is like the governance by the readers of books. It's like an elite that governs, but there's no king. And they, after all, are a democracy. I mean, they have elections, whether you think they're as fair as Bush versus Gore, whatever. I mean, elections are elections. The bogus people always seem to get their way with them. But at any rate, they have elections, they have a majlis, it has authority, and then there is this, governing court, Supreme Court kind of situation, and they have the oversight over the democracy. But it's a democracy. Now, this is a direct challenge to Saudi governance, because it's saying that we are a republic, but we're not secular. We are an Islamic republic. This was a huge threat. In August of 1980, the Saudi king will invite Saddam Hussein, comes and visits in Riyadh, tells him, you will attack Iran and we will pay you $1 billion a month as payment. And that's indeed what Saddam does. He invades Iran, huge Western backing comes in, the West provides all the chemical needs for the Iraqis. I mean, I remember standing in Los Angeles in 1989 or 88 with a sign, for the victims of Halabja. I don't even think anybody honked their horn. There were about 6, 7 of us standing there. Nobody knew what the shit we were. What is Halabja? Is that like an Arab sweet? Like baklava, Halabja, what is this Halabja? Of course, when the Americans wanted to go to war against Iraq, then Halabja becomes a big deal, and you hear like George Bush saying, Halabja! What the hell, Rumsfeld? You were there signing the agreement to give them, chlorine gas and all this crap that they use, So at those days, of course, they were gung-ho. Why were they gung-ho? The Iranians were revisionists. They threatened the order, just like the communists at the time. Now, I don't carry any water for the Iranians. I don't believe in any religious governance or anything. On the other hand, that's the regime that's there, and it was a serious threat. Now, when that war basically went to zero, I mean, I don't know how many of you remember that war, 1980 to 1988. Yeah. Nobody won even 1 inch of territory. The Iraqis used chemical gas against the Iranians. One thing you have to say about the Iranians, and they say it now when they're in the nuclear negotiations, they never retaliated with chemical weapons. Mm-hmm. They had the means to hit back with all kinds. They never used any chemical because they opposed weapons of mass destruction. So they were getting hammered. I mean, their young fellows were running across the line getting hit by mustard gas, but they didn't retaliate. It's really amazing. Because their Ayatollahs had given fatwas saying it's very bad to use chemical weapons. We have experienced it before, we oppose it. So now in the nuclear negotiations, they bring this up. They say, by the way, at least 4 years we withstood chemical attacks, we never retaliated. We took it and we fought back with conventional means. Anyway, one can take that how you will. But the point I'm trying to develop now is that when the Iranian Revolution happened, inside Saudi Arabia, there was a very disturbing development, which is that in the Masjid al-Haram, this young, crazy cleric, homemade cleric, took over the mosque, the main mosque, one of the 2 main mosques in Saudi Arabia, and held it militarily, and had to be expelled. The Saudi military had to enter and kill them. This was a great moment of fear for the Saudi elite. In other words, the virus of Islamic republicanism had entered the kingdom. So there's a very interesting thing that develops. Remember, they have been for a generation spreading views that left ideas, progressive ideas, and anti-Islamic, and had incubated pockets of support all across the Muslim world. Plus, they had used the enormous petrodollars to buy mosques here and there and to set up schools. I mean, that network is very important. When the Soviets enter Afghanistan in 1978, it's a huge opportunity in 79. I mean, until 1979, the Saudis didn't have an enormous role to play in Afghanistan. After 1979, especially after the capture of Masjid al-Haram, the Saudis were very eager to export all their crazies out to Afghanistan. Later they'll send them to Chechnya, and of course now to Syria and Libya and wherever. They exported an enormous number of these young, disaffected people out into Afghanistan. Now, it's so interesting. They were well aware what they were doing, in a sense. They sent them out there, and their role wasn't to fight, always. It was also to be teachers. Because these were educated young people, many of them with engineering degrees, who would then go and work in schools, teaching Arabic to young kids, etc. But all with this very far out there ideology. You know, it was so far out there that even the Saudis were scared of them, and therefore exported them out. It's interesting, the Saudi princes spent a lot of money building schools, training institutions for young people in the borderlands of Afghanistan and Pakistan. There's a great story when the head of Saudi intelligence, Prince Turki al-Fazl, arrives in a private plane in Kandahar to go and meet the leadership of the Taliban. As his plane was taxiing into the airport, all these Talibs came running out to hug him and to greet him, and they were all enthusiastic, like he's a rock star, and he was confused. Why are you, behaving like this? They said, you don't recognize us, we studied at your school. The school you had set up in Peshawar, we studied there. This was the movement that brings together, on the one side, the World Muslim League kind of literature, kind of anti-left, anti-progressive thinking, which the Saudis exported as part of this counter-revolutionary dynamic, fully backed by the CIA, in fact, fully backed by the US government. Because the State Department was very much in favor of sending this literature into Soviet Central Asia, and particularly into Pakistan and Afghanistan. So one was this ideological work. Secondly, in the reaction to the Iranian Revolution, they exported people who become teachers on the one side and fighters on the other. And they financed a ton of these organizations, which, if you have to understand, we're talking about Afghanistan, where there are myriad groups that are fighting against the Soviets, then later fighting in a civil war. And the group that gets Saudi money is enormously advantaged over the others, because they can buy better weapons, they can buy shoes. There's Anand Gopal has a new book out on Afghanistan, which begins with the story of a Taliban leader by the name of Mullah Cable, because he liked to whip people with a cable. But Mullah Cable had no shoes. His group had no money to buy shoes. So when 9/11 happened and the Taliban was getting bombed, his band of followers went to see a bomb explosion in the next valley, and they were all taken out by a missile strike. But he was saved because he had no shoes. He literally had no shoes. He had no money to buy. But remember, if you have a group that's getting enormous Saudi money, they're well equipped. And that advantages you much greater than, if you think of somebody like an American troop, which they're highly logistically, they have guns, they have all this stuff. Most of these fellows have just a gun and their regular clothes. Now they receive $5 million, and there are only 25 of them. They can get Stinger missile, they can get good shoes, good jackets, they don't suffer hypothermia, they don't fall ill. You all know that in a battle, it's less getting shot and more falling ill, because the conditions of life are bad, the food is bad. So if your logistics improve, your fighting effectivity is much greater. All this advantaged the kind of crazy element, and they took it out on the rest of society. So during the Afghan jihad, fully supported again by the West, every progressive current in Waziristan was wiped out. It's not that Waziristan is somehow geographically and culturally prone to the Taliban. This was an area, as I said, which had a very strong left tradition. But they were wiped out, and I mean literally killed off, assassinated, one after the other. We see the same exact thing happen in all these movements. In Iraq, the similar kind of thing happened. What is ISIS doing? It's wiping out all people who are its threat. Who are threatening it? The left. all old organizers getting just wiped out, bumped off one after the other. In a city like Hawija, where there was a big demonstration, tent city, part of the Arab Spring, the Iraqi army cracked down on it in August of 2013, killed perhaps 1,000 people. ISIS then took the city and wiped out the organizers, the main leaders of this peaceful, nonviolent protest. So that's the ideology. It's to remove the left entirely and to bring, but of course it's unstable. And that's the West's problem. That this strategy is always going to create blowback because you're playing with fire. But I wanted to tell you this story in order to underline one point, that the emergence of, and I'm going to come just a little bit to ISIS in a minute, the emergence of these forces after 1979 isn't through the discourse and tradition of Islam. It is through the counter-revolutionary tactics of world politics from 1950s onward. You know, it's not like this is a conspiracy, it's a set of processes set in motion because something scary had appeared in world history. And what was scary was the emergence of the left in this region, and it was crushed. Now, coming directly to ISIS, this is the background in a way. Coming directly to ISIS, last year I had been reporting the emergence of ISIS in Fallujah and Ramadi. They had taken these cities last year, long before the taking of Mosul. They'd taken big cities in Anbar province in Iraq, and the media here was totally silent. They took Raqqa, which is a big city in northern Iraq. They took Deir ez-Zor, which is on the border between Iraq, and the media was silent. So my favorite moment was, as I had been covering this for The Hindu, I had written over the course of last year that there is this group emerging, and this is going to be very disturbing, because this group is not merely another insurgent group. This is not a terrorist organization. This is a mass movement. This group is an army. And I was invited to breakfast with some ambassadors from northern European countries, and their whole situation with me was, why are you exaggerating the Islamic element of the great rebellion in Syria? Because you see, in Syria, there's a bad regime and there's the people. And by talking about these forces, you are simply doing the regime's work. And I thought, firstly, I'm reporting the story, and I'm seeing this stuff, and I'm meeting these guys, and I don't think these are the people. I think this is something quite different. So who are these people? There was a glimpse in Ramadi. Because when you saw the trucks sitting there, white Toyota trucks ready to drive into Syria, normally in places like Peshawar or wherever you see these Talibani, Al-Qaeda type fighters, these guys are disorganized. I mean, these people don't know how to fight. They know how to hold a gun and they'll go running up a hill and all of them will get killed. Or they'll kill everybody. Or they like to go and kill kids. Because, you don't need tactical anything. You just walk into a classroom and mow down children. Well-known problem in the United States, that's what happened. I mean, it was like a school shooting, in Peshawar. They walked into the school and just mowed kids down. It was brutal. You're not fighting a battle. This is not war. This is just slaughter. So this stuff they were good at. In Syria and Iraq, it's different. There were these guys. Now, first you have these 20-odd-year-old gunslingers, the Jesus guys with the Kalashnikov. But then you have these 40-year-old men who had everybody in command. So who were they? You see, it's very easy to tell the story of ISIS as the story of, from the 1950s onward, the emergence of the jihadis. That's the tale I just told you. But that doesn't explain ISIS. That explains the emergence of jihadis, and it explains in some way the death of the left, or at least the delegitimacy of the left, financed by the CIA, financed by the Saudis, and promoted by the Saudis through their literature, etc. It doesn't explain the rise of ISIS. To understand ISIS, you have to do the opposite of what Tony Blair says. When ISIS took Mosul, Tony Blair immediately gave a statement saying, this has nothing to do with the war in Iraq. And when he says that, I mean, why were you so touchy, Tony? I mean, what's the problem, man? Who said anything about the Iraq war? These guys just took Mosul, and he immediately said, my $25 million contracts per year shouldn't be touched. I didn't make any mistakes. You know, what the? But there is something to that. When the torture report was released, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the so-called Caliph of the Islamic State, released a statement saying, you know, this report doesn't surprise us because we are not, you know, motivated by the Quran directly. That's not what radicalized us. We are not radicalized by, you know, bin Laden, which is actually true because that Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi would call himself the Caliph and disregard Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of Al-Qaeda, is very significant. He's saying Al-Qaeda is irrelevant, which is what they keep saying. Anyway, he said it's not Al-Qaeda, it's not. We were radicalized by Bush and Blair. That was his statement. He said, we know this, what's in this report. I mean, we've been in those prisons. We know what it's like. You radicalized us. It's more than that. There are those 40-something men who know how to keep things in order. I mean, you'll remember this. When the Americans went into Baghdad in 2003, that foolish man, what was his name before Paul Bremer? Jay Garner. Basically Bush's buddy, right? Golf cart driving pal. You know, they promulgated 2 illegal ordinances. Order number 1 and order number 2. Order number 1, I think, was anybody with Baath Party membership not allowed to join in any, you know, job. Order number 2, army is disbanded. Now that army was, of course, itself disbanded before they announced this, because the Iraqi army, like any smart character, wasn't going to stay around to fight the Americans directly. I mean, what did you expect? When the US planes started bombing Baghdad, you know, a couple of days earlier, because they gave them some leeway and then just bombed early, what do you think was going to happen? Do you think the Iraqi army was going to line up on a plane, you know, the plane of Jars, and they were going to stand there and wait to get bombed the shit out of by some American planes? No, they took their uniforms off and disappeared. And then they regrouped as Fadain Saddam. And they started the insurgency. And then they formed different groups, such as Izzat al-Duri's group, the Naqshbandi army of Anbar province, which became very effective in guerrilla fighting. These guys, who were disbanded, become the guts of the Islamic State. These people are highly trained in set-piece battlefields. You know, they know how to organize military, tactical military operations. These are not the strategic thinkers. You don't have the old Baath generals as members of the Islamic State. Those Baath generals are all secular Arab nationalists. They won't know what to do with these guys. You know, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi was a sergeant or a lieutenant, it's not clear, in the Iraqi army. That's about the level where you're at. They have good tactical experience. This is something that the Al-Qaeda groups never had. You know, if you read the torture report, and I recommend it highly, you'll discover that most of them were quite foolish. You know, Jose Padilla goes to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and says, I know how to make a dirty bomb. He had read a satirical website which said that it was like making methamphetamine. You know, you put the makings of meth, you put it on a bicycle and go mountain biking, it shakes up the bottle and you can make meth like that. It's, you know, police departments around the country look out for people who are, you know, frantically mountain biking with bottles of, all kinds of bottles all over. Apparently it's a very easy way of mixing up the chemical reaction. Well, this fellow read a website which said if you take some isotopes, put them in a plastic bag and then shake it above your head, you can have some kind of fusion and then you can make a dirty, you know, it's a satirical website. And he actually goes to Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and says, I'm going to go to Chicago, make a dirty bomb. I'm going to shake these uranium isotopes. Where the hell is he going to get uranium isotopes? And this is not going to make a bomb. It's a joke. It's a really interesting and sad part of the torture report. Was, you know, the people writing it show that these guys are idiots, you know, many of them. The Islamic State battlefield commanders are not idiots. These are real battlefield commanders. And they have crazy people willing to take orders from them, and they're actually having military victories. This is not terrorism of the Al-Qaeda sort. This is something different. So, on the one side, what is happening in, say, a place like Peshawar, what is happening in these great cities with great histories, they have been destroyed by the history of the Cold War. These cities have been destroyed. Their histories have been eroded and corroded. And then you have the very special development after the Iraq War of the emergence of the Islamic State. The Islamic State is a child of the Iraq War. It is not a child of Islam. It is not a phenomena of Islam. It is a phenomena of the Iraq War. So now you'll ask me, what's wrong with the Muslims? Well, my answer is, it's all in history. It's not in theology. Thanks. Questions, I hope plenty. I'm looking forward to some challenging questions, please.
Well, I'm not sure how great these questions are. First, I
What?
just wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
When you said, I thought it was Bremer that did the de-Baathification.
Maybe. It
Oh,
could be.
okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I knew it was one of them.
Okay, and then the other thing is, I just wondered about your book, why do you call it a possible history of?
This is a good question. My publisher was not keen on this title. There are histories of the past, and then there are possibilities of the future. And my book is written as a possible history that's going into the future. Meaning, it's looking at trajectories that if we struggle in this direction, possibly could give us a future. Because right now I don't think we have a future. I think we have a present that's just going to go on forever.
Yeah.
For me, a future means something different. And we are going to just sort of live in an interminable crappy present. Oh, sorry, fracking present. And that's just going to go on forever. So for me, history doesn't mean repetition. It has to have some element of improvement. And I mean, I don't think we've had a history in a long time. I think we've just sort of been spinning our wheels in some kind of mess, And, you say, well, somebody will say something, there was these great protest movements, the Ferguson protests, South Africa, there's a new development, the Mine Workers Union has created a new United Left Front. These things keep happening. But there's no breakthrough. I mean, the last time we saw a real breakthrough in the planet was in Latin America. And that breakthrough continues to have problems, but it maintains its integrity. You will have 100 critiques of Bolivia, 100 critiques of Venezuela, 100 critiques of Uruguay, but listen.
They went out and voted.
They went out and voted, but it's more than that. They built institutions. They built institutions, they built movements. Look, the country of Uruguay just took 6 prisoners from Guantanamo. And the current outgoing president of Uruguay, Jose Mojica, spent 13 years in isolation. So he had a personal stake in bringing these, and he welcomed the 6, there are 3 Syrians, a Tunisian and a Palestinian, or 4 Syrians, Tunisian and Palestinian, 1 Lebanese actually. The guy I wrote about, Abu Wael Diab, is born in Lebanon, moved to Syria as a child. Anyway, but he welcomed them saying, you're welcome to leave at any point. You're not coming here as a prisoner. You're coming here, you get an Uruguayan passport. And their reply was very moving. I was very moved by it. They said, we want to learn Spanish. We want to build our lives here. Our lives are ruined. We want to build a future. We want a history. So that's why it's a possible history, because, I don't feel it. Honestly, I mean, I look at these good things and I just don't feel good about them. Other than that, I don't feel depressed either. The opposite of not feeling good is not depressed. Yes, please.
Can I clarify that a little further? Okay. First of all, is there a relationship between Saudi Arabia and ISIS? A. B. When you describe them as being radicalized by, Bush and Blair, how sectarian are they? And could you just give us a little more depth about who ISIS is?
Correct. Well, I'm glad you asked it, because I meant to talk about, I said I was going to, and I forgot, the sectarian piece of it. So it is the case that the people, so what is ISIS? ISIS is a group that is founded in Iraq in 2004 as the Al-Qaeda in Mesopotamia. And, it was led at the time by a Jordanian militant, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who comes from Jordan. Iraq has no history of Al-Qaeda. Contrary to what Abu Sheikh al-Libbi said while being tortured in an Egyptian prison, said that there was no link. That was utterly bogus. And when the instability happens, these guys show up. And Abu Musab al-Zarqawi comes with an extremely sectarian politics, where it was clear that that first Al-Qaeda group in Iraq hated the Shia more than it hated the West. So they would use the most derogatory language, Rafida, horrible rejectors. They would call the Shia rejectors. And it was so bad that he started these bombings of Shia religious sites in 2004. It was so bad that bin Laden rebuked him. It's very interesting. Like today, the Afghan Taliban criticized the Pakistani Taliban for attacking the school. It's like you got to get into the heads of, there are distinctions. So bin Laden was very angry with Zarqawi, saying you should not go in the sectarian direction. Our principal problem is with our kings, Saudi Arabian king, and the West, not with the Shia. Okay, so Zarqawi brings that in. This anti-Shia strand is very strong in Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi politics is governed through a view that the Shia have rejected, they're apostates. So this is very much a piece of the kind of anti-Iran thing that develops after 79. But what's really interesting is until 1979, the anti-Shia thing was not a big deal. So the politics, when the politics is convenient, you dig into your side saddle and pull out the handbook. And then you start saying, the Shia are rejectors. I don't remember reading about this from Saudi literature in the 60s and 50s. Even the World Muslim League pamphlets don't fulminate against the Shia. So this anti-Shia thing is definitely there in Saudi Arabia, but it's a post-79 phenomenon. I mean, in India, which has the second largest Shia population in the world, in 1908 is the first Shia-Sunni clash. And it's about property. So it's not even clear that it was about religion. It's a complicated thing in the city of Lucknow, which is, maybe third or fourth largest Shia city in the world. Huge Shia population in India. So anyway, the point I'm making there is that the sectarianism that comes out of Zarqawi has a role inside the Iraqi radical Islamist kind of tendency. He brings it in. Then by the time the Islamic State people get going, that is to say, when it's revived in 2006 as the Islamic State of Iraq, it is true that private funding from Saudi and Qatari and other princes enters the Islamic State of Iraq. That is now taken for granted by intelligence agencies in that region. Everybody will tell you there was private funding. And journalists have also met Kuwaiti, Qatari, and Saudi princes who tell them, I financed this group or that group associated with the Islamic State. The governments didn't finance. Now, when we're talking about a country like Qatar, for instance, where there's 200,000 citizens, and everybody is a millionaire because of the gas money, again, if we're talking about some bedraggled Iraqi town, and I come and hand a check for $1 million, I have given 10 times more than any other group has in that town. So, the opportunity cost, of struggle is, it greatly advantages these little groups that get this money. You don't need to get 500 million from the Saudi state. If you get 1 million from this sheikh, 2 million from this, that's a lot of money. Okay, so there is private funding. It's the same in the growth of the jihadi networks in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The money came privately. So I don't believe that there is direct Saudi help. Not necessarily. There may be. We just don't have enough evidence. But the evidence that is there is that there is this. Now, that sectarian trend that comes from Zarqawi intensifies in ISIS. So one of the things that the media here, I think, has done a bad job of explaining is ISIS is actually more against the Shia than it's against the West. this last beheading of Peter Abdul Rahman Kasik, it was the last video of the beheading. If you watch the whole video, which unfortunately I watched the whole video, the video begins very interestingly. It's a long video, it's about 18-19 minutes. It begins with the American invasion of Iraq. It doesn't begin anywhere else. And then it says, after the Americans came and they destroyed Iraq, they handed the country over to the rejectors. And there's images of an Ashura event in the town of Najaf. And Ashura events are beautiful public demonstrations where people dance on the street and in a square. And they show and say, these disgusting rejectors, they spit in the face of Allah, look at how they behave in public. They have been given this great Baghdad by the Americans. And then the tone switches, and there are 120 Syrian soldiers who are brought next to a trench, and then they are all beheaded. And as they are being beheaded, 120, as they are being beheaded, the language is all about them being Shia or Alawite. And then in the end, there is a 20-second image of Kasik's body. And the whole Western media talked about that as the video of Kasik's death. But that was irrelevant to the video. The video was utterly anti-Shia. So their politics is governed like that. But this is a very recent phenomenon.
So this is a social movement which exploits the tribalism, it sounds like, of Shia against Sunni against the Shia, and its social base is heavily involved with identifying that kind of cultural ideology as its social force, and it's going to take over this country and make it into a Sunni heaven or whatever.
No movement is able to develop without a cultural content. A movement of the left has a cultural content. Like if I was to enunciate the principles of my movement, it would be things like, complete social freedom. It would be, cultural diversity. These would be, you have to have a culture. You have to have some kind of, creative approach to people's problems in life. In say American right-wing movement, they have an approach. They talk about America as a Christian country. When the Republicans won this midterm election, they gave a slogan, America has taken back America again. And that America means something. It means, whites or Christians or whatever, the Kenyans have been ousted from power, whatever the hell it means. It has cultural content. So this is the cultural content of ISIS. Now we can exaggerate the cultural content and say this is what drives them, which is what some people do, or we can say it is only part of their process. So it is certainly a social movement with a very different kinds of strains that come into it. This plays a role. It's silly to ignore it because it's a brutal part of their existence, but it doesn't define them. That's the thing, yeah.
Now, I want to hear from you more about the Sunni-Shia split. Before the war in Iraq, whoever heard that this existed? But so Iran plays a big role in this, even though it's not, it's not publicly discussed. They're not beheading people in public and things like that. But the big fear of Iran, one, it's a very large country. In many ways, it's a very advanced country. That the Shias only make up 20% of the Muslims in the world. I think the Sunnis are the vast majority. But Saudi Arabia is completely obsessed with this. So is Israel, and so is the United States. So I guess I'd like to know more. One is the fear of the Shias taking on more power. The other is oil, because part of the question also is is the fact that the Saudis and OPEC did not do something to raise the price of oil. Is that also related to Iran and weakening Iran's oil exports? So yeah, if you could talk a little more about that.
No, firstly, like in many religious traditions, the idea that human beings are all going to agree on a religion is absurd. I mean, every religious tradition has some kind of schisms that develop. I mean, can you think of a religious tradition that hasn't had, maybe the Unitarians, because basically I don't even know what they believe in. I mean, it's like, even the Unitarians have no idea what they believe in. So there's no schism because, in fact, there's unity because didn't the Unitarians join with the Universalists? Soon, I hope they take everybody over because it's like non-stop grad school, but, other religions always have some difference of doctrine. I mean, that's the problem of an absent God. The ultimate arbiter is not there to tell you who's right. So in the name of the absent God, you're going to say, I'm more correct than you. So these things are there in every religion. And in fact, Islam is not simply divided between Shia and Sunni, but Sunni is also a misnomer. Because there are so many different Sunni traditions. There are so many Shia traditions. I grew up in a neighborhood in Calcutta which had a very large Shia population. Now, what was the Shia population? Well, there were Ismailis, there were Bohras, there were Dawdis. I mean,
well, we are Protestant, which is...
Yeah, Protestant. I mean, how many Protestants are there? So there are these two Shia Sunni provide an ideological, they have an ideological job, which I'll come to in a minute. I just want to be clear that these are very complicated worlds, and it's perfectly human to have these disagreements. And these disagreements have been there from the beginning, in this particular case, meaning from the third caliph onward. This is a very serious disagreement, and that has been... It is true that Iran poses a significant threat to the region. It's also true that the Iranian threat is totally misconstrued. When you talk to Iranian diplomats, for instance, and ask them, what's the problem when you negotiate with Americans? Firstly, they tell you Americans don't understand us. I mean, you talk to an Iranian and you say, what are the most important events in the 20th century? Some of them will begin in 1906. And, I don't know how many Americans know what happened in Iran in 1906. They had a majlis, parliament was created. It was a huge thing in Iranian history. And then they'll talk about the 50s. I mean, every Iranian wants to bring up the problem of the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh. I mean, it's like so they will say, and I think they're right, that have we ever overthrown an American government? Which American president did we overthrow? We voted in a prime minister in 1951, and the British and the Americans overthrew him. You have intervened in and then who did you give us to rule? You gave us the most brutal dictator in Iranian history, the Shah of Iran, the last Shah, who set up the SAVAK, totally trained by foreigners, and then you had Jimmy Carter come to Tehran and say that the Shah of Iran is a great force for good in the region. I mean, you spit in our face, and then you tell us that we are a threat to you, so they tell you. And finally they'll say there was indeed this revolution in 1978-79. It was an Iranian revolution where, like in Egypt recently, the progressive forces were not strong enough and the Islamists seized power. So they created an Islamic Republic. But it was an Iranian revolution. And they cracked down on the left. They rejected the fact that in their ideological heritage, there was, the great thinker Ali Shariati, who wrote very interesting things about the link between Marxism and Islam, took very seriously other ideologies. These are interesting histories inside Iran. So Iran becomes a geopolitical threat. There is no question. By the way, how many people died when the Iranians took the US embassy? They didn't kill anybody. It's really interesting, Not one person was killed. It would have been easy to kill a few. They didn't kill anybody. This is all in the mind of the Iranians when they sit and talk to America. They say, look, you're going to tell us all these things. How many people did we kill? You lost an ambassador in Benghazi. We didn't kill anybody in Tehran. We held them hostage because there was a political upheaval in the country. It's not like everything was under control. Anyway, it was a serious geopolitical threat. And that geopolitical threat from 1979 has been attempted to be strangled. I mean, from 79 they fight a brutal war till 1988. That was brutal. Then in 1988, 89, when the war ends, Saddam Hussein goes back to the Kuwaitis and the Saudis and says, pay me money. You only paid me $7 billion for the first 7 months of the war. That bloody war lasted 10 years. Pay me my money back. And the Saudis said, go to hell. Kuwaitis said, no way. Then he accuses the Kuwaitis of drilling into Iraqi oil fields. Then he goes and sees American ambassador April Glaspie in August 1990 and says, I'm going to take care of the Kuwaitis. And she says to him, America doesn't have an opinion. This is an internal Arab dispute. And he invades Kuwait. Stupid man. And then, so meanwhile, the Iranians are sitting back. And by the way, after 9/11, the United States attacks and removes from their neighborhood 2 of Iran's major existential threats. On the one side, Saddam Hussein, who they hated, and on the other side, the Taliban, whom they hated. And so the United States actually provides Iran an enormous strategic victory, geopolitical victory, opens up the borders. But it's interesting, having delivered that gift to Iran, this would have been a moment to open doors to Tehran, because there were actually geostrategic linkages. But then comes the whole pressure about the bomb. And for that, I don't have time to go into that, but there's a terrific book written by Gareth Porter called Manufacturing Danger or something. It's a terrific book of why the Iranian nuclear question became a big deal after 9/11. And it has only something to do with Israel, not entirely to do with Israel. Only something. There are other games afoot. So, yes.
Actually, that was going to be my question about the role of Israel in these conflicts.
Well, I'll tell you something interesting. I was at a event about ISIS at another town in this state, in New York State, and it was at a state university, and I was discussing ISIS, and somebody on the panel said, well, why are you ignoring Israel? And I thought that was interesting, because I thought he was going to attack me for being anti-Semitic, which is what sometimes happens, but he was attacking me for not talking about Israel. And I thought, hello, normally you'll say, what right do you have to talk about Israel? Now you're telling me, why aren't you talking about Israel? So it's a funny thing. I mean, in this particular emergence, I actually don't think, like some of my friends on the left, that Israel is playing a big role. I actually think the strategic people in Israel are not comfortable with the events taking place next door. Israel recently attacked the Lebanese border and the Damascus airport. And what they struck was missile shipments from Iran to Hezbollah. And there was no retaliation. A couple of years ago, I think 2010, Israel attacked inside Syria and bombed a building, which they claimed was a nuclear site. There was no retaliation from the Syrians. It was very interesting. I mean, imagine if a Syrian flight had gone into Israeli airspace, not even bombed anything, it would have been taken out immediately. The relationship between Damascus and Israel is a fascinating one. I mean, for all the rhetoric that comes from Bashar al-Assad, Damascus has been a very quiet player in securing the security of the Israeli frontier. There's no operations allowed from Syria into Israel. That border was very safe for Israel. So a very interesting relationship. And for a while there was enthusiasm about overthrowing Assad, but it was very clear by 2012 that the Israelis did not want that government to fall. It would have been a disaster. I mean, if you look at it from the point of view of Israel, it's understandable. Why would they want some unidentifiable object to come to power in Damascus? As it is, you have Morsi in Cairo, who allowed an Iranian military ship to go through the Suez Canal. Actually, not Morsi didn't allow that. His predecessor allowed, Nabil al-Arabi allowed, the first revolutionary government allowed Iranian warship to go through the Suez Canal, first time since 1979. It had become a very dangerous neighborhood. So last thing the Israelis wanted was, Jabhat al-Nusra governing from, because it's unpredictable. These groups are unpredictable. That's the thing about blowback, is you cannot control the forces you unleash. They are unpredictable. They may not today want to attack Israel. After all, Nusra is holding a border post with Israel. But who's to say what happens tomorrow? Because they have very strong anti-Israeli rhetoric. Yeah.
First, let me say thanks for the talk and thanks for all your writing in recent years. It's been a real sort of learning light for me. I want to ask you to go back to the earlier part of the history of what you were talking about, that sort of Bandung era moment, where I understood what you to be doing was moving the counterinsurgency part away from a kind of left, which included a capital L left, communist left, and a nationalist left. And I guess I wondered if you could drive a little bit of a wedge between those two left parties and make clear some of the contradictions there, because it seems to me that one of the defining features of that Bandung moment is the way in which a nationalist left kind of sweeps away the possibility of a workers' movement, of a class-driven politics, sometimes with disastrous effects. And I'm thinking of Indonesia and so forth, where the failures to really cohere as a communist left party and workers' movement allow for these weird compromises to take place. That's enormously effective in allowing for the sort of counterinsurgency forces that you're talking about to return. Can you talk a little bit about that earlier period?
Yeah, so yes, these movements had a great deal of resilience up to the 1940s and 50s. The left movements, the workers' movement in Egypt, for instance, was a very powerful movement. A couple of things I think are important. One is that when these coups take place, like the Nasserite coup in Egypt, there was a kind of tradition that builds up within these kind of third world states, where the view was that the one-party state was very important, and that if you allowed multi-party entities, imperialism could enter. That was their theory, that if you allowed liberals to organize, that would be a vehicle for imperialism to insert. So you don't allow any second party, you just have your one party. Well, this meant there's a problem, because if you're a nationalist pretending to be on the left, you have these left-wing people. Secondly, Moscow in the 1940s and 50s had lost the appetite entirely for allowing world revolution. And you had, like in Egypt, for instance, Moscow basically told the Communist Party of Egypt, liquidate yourself, join the Nasserites. And either they liquidated or they died in prison. Because that was the future of, Nasser was more anti-communist than anti-brotherhood. In fact, the brotherhood was allowed to survive, and Nasser's lieutenant, who was Anwar Sadat, was the liaison to the brotherhood. They were allowed to exist, but the left had to be crushed. In Iraq, similarly, it's a huge party. If they had actually conducted a coup, in the 1960s, they would have forestalled a Ba'ath coup. They would have come to power. They sent leadership to Moscow. Moscow tells them, no, you should collaborate with the Nasserites, and they were crushed. In Syria, same thing. Khalid Bagdash, who was the leader of the Syrian Communist Party, very powerful party, was loath to attempt to take power in a putsch kind of arrangement. They had a lot of people in the military as well, and they held back, and then there's a Ba'athist coup in 1963. And that's when the Ba'ath comes to power. Later, Hafiz al-Assad will come to power in 1970. But 63, there's a coup. They could have been the ones who did the coup. So it's a combination of this one-party state apparatus that, and I understand the logic. If you have multi-parties, if you don't trust the people can get corrupted, if you take that view. Secondly, Moscow was entirely reticent. So it's only places where, and it's no point romanticizing armed struggle, because in Iraq, when the left was crushed, they went into armed struggle in the southern marshes of Iraq, and then a generation of people were slaughtered. So, it's like, I've always found the armed struggle strategy a terrible strategy. Instead of going among the people and trying to build confidence, you just get an entire generation of young people killed. And it's like Peru, a whole generation was wiped out in the war against, an impossible war, which you'll never win. You'll never succeed. In India, I see that now. You can romanticize Indian Maoists as much as you want, but generation of young people in the 70s was slaughtered. Young, smart, bright people were just sent, to police encounters. It's a terrible way to go. So that was, in a sense, the direction. Therefore, I can understand people of the left joining nationalist movements and, in a sense, minimizing their own left. The left revives in the region, not in these countries. It revives through the Palestinian struggle. So in the Arab national movement, in places like in Beirut, where people like Habash and others, bring back the legitimacy of the left, and then you get the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, with very dynamic, ideological figures like Ghassan Kanafani, people like that. They will revive left ideas. But it had been smashed. I mean, the one thinker that I'm trying to revive interest in is a man named Hassan Hamdan, who again he was in Beirut, wrote in Lebanon, was a very senior thinker in the left movement. He was known as Mahdi Amal. He was assassinated in 87, but between the 70s and 87, he had a huge following, such that during the Arab Spring in the University of Tunisia, there was a big mural of his face. These are beloved traditions that need to be revived, oxygenated, because they remain despite. So there was that crushing in the 50s, there was a revival in the late 60s. And there, the PLO does play an important role at the time of allowing these left currents to emerge. And, but these left currents were also smothered. After all, PFLP had to take refuge in Damascus. So did the DFLP, the Democratic Front. And, the Assad regime is not a keen regime to left-wing currents. It likes its left to have free accommodation in the very finest of Damascus prisons. Yes?
Can you say a little more about where you see potential forces for change, particularly around the influence of the Palestinian struggle? That struggle itself and where it has influence in the region, and where you see the seeds of possible liberation movements, both in terms of the remnants of progressive movements of the past and also the emergence of youth right now? Where do you see the possibilities of emergence? Because some of the things that you've said about the crushing of the left, you could say them about Latin America as well.
Right.
It was crushed, and it wasn't so obvious where those new strands were going to come from, but they did.
You're right. I mean, but every country has its crushing. And in Latin America, the crushing was also done through exile. In Chile, for instance, so many parts of the communist leadership and socialist leadership went abroad. And, including Bachelet, they will return and revive their movements and, etc. Brazil is similar. Many of them took refuge outside. And then, of course, the ones that remained went deep into the workers' movement. And the disadvantage, of course, of today's condition is that there is no workers' movement either. In other words, with the way production has been disarticulated, workers are much weakened today than they were in the days when Lula could organize an auto factory in the auto belt in southern Brazil. I mean, in other words, their revival was at a time which was propitious to a certain kind of organizing. Today, labor organizing is simply not possible in the workplace. I'll come back to that in a minute. But firstly, what you say is correct. It's important to look for embers. And I would not necessarily start my ember search in the Palestinian movement. Palestine is a place of survival. It is no longer a place of leadership for any struggle in the region. On the one side, you have Gaza, which is on life support. And on the other side, you have the West Bank, which is being suffocated by neoliberalism. The PA, is a disastrous institution. It's Oslo's golden handcuffs. And I mean, where is the space, where you NGOize of, an entire generation of people who would have been militants, now work for NGOs. I mean, it's a whole different world. So I wouldn't necessarily look there. I would start actually not from a radical point of view, but from a liberal point of view. I mean, one of the great outcomes of the Arab Spring is Tunisia, where, they write a constitution, they have an election, terrible forces might have won the election, but there is a understanding about new kind of politics there that doesn't include the gun. I think it's important to recognize that sometimes these constitutional developments are important. It's the first constitution written freely by an Arab population. It's a big deal. I think it's an important issue. Where do you look? In Egypt, the demoralization is so complete. You've gone from the high of Tahrir Square to the extreme low of a protest law, a law against not protesting, but calling for a protest. People are in prison for 7-8 years for calling for a protest. Writing a pamphlet saying, let's demonstrate. You can go to jail for 6-7 years. It's a brutal crackdown on liberty. So the demoralization is very much there. So when you look at these situations, you're not going to find, hope. I mean, the very fact that there is talk of an axis of resistance that includes Hezbollah, the Assad regime, the government in Baghdad, and Iran, as this axis against the rise of the Islamic State, tells you how bad the situation is for a progressive movement. I sometimes, I hear these terms and I understand the relevance they have, because after all, people are given in the region a choice between, kind of ISIS governance versus, maybe some kind of now very much weakened Assad governance. And it's a tough choice it's a tough real choice. In America, we can say there's got to be a third way. There's got to be a better future, but may not be at the present. So people are facing some pretty crappy choices at present. And I think that's where we are. That doesn't mean there are no embers there. I think that there is, even among people who end up joining some of these organizations, they don't lack for a broader imagination. Contradictions are going to intensify in the region. The worst way for the contradictions to intensify is around sectarian politics. This axis of evil is entirely marked by sectarianism. This is a Shia axis against the Islamic State. It's a terrible way to define politics, because it simply falls into the trench of sectarianism. There's got to be other, and there will be other ways. They're simply not so easy to see now. Now, why would I lie to you and say, the victorious people of Egypt are going to rise up? I mean, what is this? The victorious people of Syria are going to defeat the vermin of Al-Qaeda. I mean, this is a joke. People are demoralized. They had a major event, which was the Arab Spring, which was for real. They rose up in Bahrain, and where was America? Where was the United States government? Totally backed the Saudis, who sent an army across the causeway and crushed the uprising. Why? Because the population of Bahrain are largely Shia, and the Sunni monarchy was against them. Even though the people protesting weren't protesting saying we want a Shia government. They simply wanted to have the right to vote. So the crackdown in Bahrain is a great demoralizer. There are good human rights activists spending 10, 12, 15-year sentences in prison for so-called insulting, the emir. The Al-Khwaja family, for instance, every one of them I think is in prison now. Zainab, Mariam, they keep going to prison. Why? They arrive in Manama airport, they get arrested. What the hell? And what does the US government do? They back what did the British government do? They just signed an agreement to create a base for the first time since 1971 east of Suez. The British are going to have a big base in Bahrain. One of the most, you're talking about Mubarak being in power 28 years, whatever. They've been in power for 174 years. Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about Assad's base?
His base?
Yes.
So, okay, Similar thing happened in Libya and Syria, which is that whatever the nature of their, when in Libya, for sure, when Gaddafi came to power in 1969, he was incredibly popular. I mean, I went to Libya first time in '74. I was a young kid. We drove from Alexandria into Benghazi and down into Tripoli, and there were billboards of this guy, beautiful guy, I mean, amazing looking guy, on the thing. People loved him. People adored this guy. I mean, he overthrew a very corrupt monarchy. King Idris was very corrupt, he was totally unloved. Gaddafi, for the first 10, 15 years, turned over a large part of oil revenue in transfer payments to the population. But once again, these guys had an allergy to democracy. They didn't believe you should allow, and I'm not talking about Western style democracy. I mean, like, whatever, man. You want to be some green book Islamic socialist? Let people have workers' committees, nothing. It was total suffocation. It's interesting, in Libya, the opposition that grows was opposition of people who trained lawyers, etc. The people that, who are they? They are people who were trained in the very institutions that Gaddafi's transfer payments produced. You produce this class and then you won't allow them to express themselves. It's ridiculous. So it's a very good history lesson if we ever take power. If we ever take power, we should allow people to have a little joy in their life, express themselves, tell us we're wrong. None of us are right. We are capable of being wrong. I would like to be told, you are full of shit. Why are we scared of that? And these guys literally did not allow any space. In Syria, similarly, they smashed the Zions, they smashed the landlords when they came into power. The Baathists were progressive in that sense. They threw them out. They allowed in the state a great social peace. Here's one interesting thing. How many Muslims live in Spain? Like, old Muslim communities. Have anybody been to Andalusia? Have you been to a Muslim village in Andalusia?
I've seen the mosques, I've seen.
There are mosques.
No Muslims were left. They threw them all out. It's interesting, you go to Syria or Iraq, and it is amazing. You drive into these areas, there's like a Christian community from like 5 years after Jesus died, these cave communities. You drive to the next town and there's some ancient community with a weird religion that believes in, I don't know, the moon phases, and like the Yazidis. I mean, these bizarre, ancient, beautiful traditions, which are, barely linked to the so-called great traditions that you read about in your religion class. These people don't belong in. These are extremely diverse societies. In Syria and Malula, there are Christians who have, very old links to Christianity, older than Christianity in Europe. By the way, Christianity comes to India before Europe. You know that, right? Saint Thomas comes to Kerala right from after the crucifixion. I mean, he gets on a boat and he's there converting Indians long before Christianity comes to Europe. This is a very, they didn't expel their diversity. They maintained it. And the Baath actually created a social peace. This is all true. Of course, it had suffocating prisons for political opposition because, again, they believed in this one-party kind of situation. It got worse in the 1990s, both in Libya and in Syria, because both these countries liberalized the state and opened the door for crony capitalism. I mean, it was atrocious. Their friends and family made money. In Syria, it's actually grotesquely bad, because who made money are Turkish companies. There was a real estate boom, and Turkish real estate firms drove across the border and built up everything that's now been destroyed. Some of it with Turkish help. I mean, they are ready to come back and reconstruct, by the way. Turks are playing a bad game here. But the point is that, in Syria, there was this contradiction which falls apart in the 1980s and 90s. And in 2005, there was a so-called Damascus Spring, when Assad promised to have some democratic reforms, but he reneged on them. There was a drought in northern Syria, there were peasant protests, pricing went haywire, and this is a problem with the kind of suffocating economic policy which suffocates the people but then frees it up for crony capitalism. And it was inevitable there were going to be demonstrations. Those demonstrations were real in 2011. Don't let anybody tell you it was like, but what happens? Good people, humane people demonstrate, and they are the first to get suffocated. Because, then you get the Saudis, Kuwaitis, etc. financing. You watch ISIS videos. Have you ever heard of a group called Jaish al-Islam? The Army of Islam. It's run by a guy called Zaran Aloush. It's an interesting name. Remember when Obama said, we're going to create a moderate force in Syria? And then he said, bizarrely, that we're going to have the Saudis help us create a moderate force. Remember this? It was really bizarre. It was in his speech. That famous, I'm going to hit ISIL. Why he keeps calling it ISIL? It's kind of weird, it's like a tick. Nobody else in the world calls it ISIL. But they made a decision in the State Department, we're going to call it ISIL. Anyway, ISIS is the god of, cats or something, right, in Egypt. So we can't call it, I don't know why they call it ISIL. Anyway, we're going to hit ISIL, and the Saudis are going to create a moderate force. The Saudis already have a force on the ground in Syria. It's called Jaish al-Islam. And it is a brutal force which does exactly what ISIS does, but they don't film it and put it on YouTube. So Zaran Aloush is a notorious gangster. In Adra, for instance, on December 13, 2013, they conducted a massacre. There's no pictures. So there was an uprising because there are real contradictions. These are not paradise. There's a problem in the American left. Is either Assad is great or he's a bastard. It's all Manichaean, and it's like good, bad. Look, the world isn't so simple. And you are not supposed to choose who you defend. You should first try to understand the complexity. There's nothing wrong with a place being complicated. That doesn't mean you say, it's too complicated, I don't want to bother. If it's complicated, you should try to understand it more. It's very much like Israel and Palestine. If you don't recognize that it's actually a complicated issue, it's not a simple issue. If you simplify it, then you're going to come up with a politics that makes no sense. What do you think? Where will the people who live in today's Israel go? If you don't want to accept that the people live there, where will they go? The reason the Palestinian groups don't recognize Israel is not because they don't want the people who live there to remain there necessarily. The reason they don't recognize Israel is because Israel doesn't delimit its borders. They will tell you that directly. How can you recognize a country that doesn't have articulated borders? Because if I say I recognize Israel and then they say, well, Israel means Judea and Samaria. Well, I didn't recognize that Israel. I meant Israel without the West Bank. Understand? I mean, Israel without Jerusalem. These are the sticking points. So, these are complicated issues. They cannot be simplified. Or they are simplified at our peril. Yeah.
Would you I'd like to have a comment about the social context you think that developed the most expensive presidential palace or dwelling in Turkey, about $630 million. And as far as the political situation there and the development of that, just build it.
Listen, Turkey is a very great country. It has an enormously interesting history. I think that there's a political development in Turkey that befuddles at least half the population, which is that the rise of Erdogan is incredibly, I think, disturbing to a lot of people in Turkey. I mean, firstly, he utilized a religious set of institutions led by a man who lives in Philadelphia, Mr. Gulen. He used the Gulen institutions to consolidate his power, and then now is going after Gulen, and is going after everybody. And so the Erdogan phenomena is important to understand. It doesn't represent, all of Turkey. There is a considerable opposition to Erdogan. It does not know how to express itself. But Erdoganism is indeed a big problem when it comes to something like Syria. Firstly, they took a forward policy. In 2011. They were the first to say Assad must go. And this phrase, so-and-so must go, it's become like a cliche in international relations. Saddam must go, somebody must go. How bizarre language this is, What's his name in Aristide must go. I mean, the Americans said that twice and removed him twice. Aristide must go. Aristide must go. Who are you to say he must go? You know, where does this get legitimacy in world politics? That you can say Putin must go, somebody must go, you know. So this idea Assad must go was very disturbing because it actually meant it hardened the Assad regime's position. The moment the West joined the must go chorus, what room is there for negotiation? So your position gets hardened. Then you're going to be much more ruthless in the crackdown. You know, I'll come back to Turkey in a minute, but I'll give you an example of this problem. There was a moment in 2004 when Saddam Hussein was caught in Tikrit. You remember, he was hiding in a sluice, in a drain. And he comes out of the drain. Does anybody remember what Saddam Hussein said? He came out of the drain and then he said two sentences.
Don't shoot, and I am the president of the republic.
He said, I am the president of Iraq, I am ready to negotiate. He said, I am ready to negotiate. And the American who got him says to him, by the way, that was good, because that's an important thing. He says, I am the president of the Republic of Iraq, I am ready to negotiate, don't shoot us. And then the American said, this is with regards from George Bush, or some jerk statement. Now, imagine if the American government had actually taken him in as a political prisoner. And imagine if he then went on TV and said, I'm negotiating with the American government, all my loyal Fadain, Saddam, Baathists, etc., we're going to get a deal from the Americans. Because, you know, I command 20% of the population. That's going to create hell for the next 3 years for the American by having an insurgency. But there was no attempt to acknowledge that he actually is a political force. That even if he doesn't have 60%, 70% support, 90% like the ridiculous elections, he commands 30% of the population. Why don't you just arrest him, let him go on TV and cut a deal with him? You know, you're gonna have to set up a political party you can't run, but you know, maybe, you know, Izzat al-Zuri can run with red hair, can run, you know, etc. You understand? Same with the Assad regime. You know, maybe he's a bad guy, but he commands a population. Some part of the Syrian population is very loyal to him. It may be sectarian, but that doesn't matter. So by saying you have to go, you're inflaming the sectarian situation. Why not say at some point we are going to have a political how can you politically negotiate when the position on the table is you have to go? So this form of politics is what Turkey indulged in a big way, and it's blown back on them. You know, they were so close to cutting a deal with the Kurds, final peace agreement. It was called the Imrali process. You know, the Erdogan government was negotiating with Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the Kurdish Workers' Party, you know, big figure in the Kurdish resistance. And they, in this Imrali process, were coming close to a final agreement. This would have been an amazing thing for Turkish history to have conducted a final agreement on the Kurdish question. Now it's finished. You know, and the reason it's finished is that this stupid position that they took led them to allow the city of Kobani on the border of Turkey and Syria, you know, within 100 meters of the Turkish border, to be almost taken by ISIS. And television crews, you remember this, when the television crews were just basically Kobani, almost falling to ISIS. And then, you know, ISIS withdrew from there, largely through American bombing. You know, which had actually, American bombing is capable of stopping the advance of ISIS. It's not capable of defeating it. That much you have to grant aerial bombardment. It definitely stops an advance, but it doesn't defeat ISIS. It's still around. So that was Turkey's terrible role, yeah.
Speaking of deal, do you think there's going to be a deal between the West and Iran in terms of the future situation with
I don't know about that.
Pardon me?
I don't know about that. I don't think it's easy to say. I think that negotiation is so much buffeted by the winds of the moment that every time they sit down, I mean, you know, what allows two powers to make a deal it's that they understand each other's narrative. You know, it's not on the agreements on so much enrichment, this much. You have to understand each other's narrative. You have to trust each other's position. And there's simply no trust at all. And you know, this is of course then exaggerated, because there is the kind of Iranian demon. And on the other side, there's the American demon. You know, and this is no way to conduct a deal. At most, there will be some space to alleviate sanctions. The Iranians are desperate for sanctions to be somewhat alleviated or to be removed. So there will be that kind of deal. In other words, it will be a deal of compulsion. But that's different from a deal. I mean, do you believe that the Iranians want to make a bomb?
Well, I think they feel that they should be able to.
But they don't. That's the interesting thing. If you don't believe what they're saying, how can I expect the American government to believe them? Last question? Or shall we move to the cookie tray? Let's move to the cookie
We
tray.
have one thing we want to do before you.
Oh, okay, fine.
Mike?
I was sitting there listening to you talk, and I was thinking it would be wonderful if you could have spoken with James Connelly with his Scottish brogue, the lilt between the two of you.
Oh, that would have been, that's interesting.
Would have been great. But you were the first speaker at the Connelly Forums. And as a token of our appreciation for having faith in the Capital District area to support something like this, we want to give you this book. I've read many books on Connelly. This is probably my favorite.
Wow, it's got a great cover. Look at this cover.
The interesting thing is it has the original notes that Connelly did at the reconquest of Ireland, which, listening to Vijay talk about why he wrote a possible history, this was Connelly's possible history of Ireland, which is still in the making right now. But I hope you enjoy.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a wonderful.
Thanks a lot.